The microphone shrieked, a high-pitched, metallic squeal that sliced through the warm, vanilla-scented air of the grand ballroom, freezing the polite chatter of 300 wealthy guests in an instant. The sound echoing off the vaulted, gold leaf ceilings and crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen tears above the dance floor. The bride, Chloe, stood in the center of the room, her $30,000 custom silk gown glowing under the amber spotlights, a malicious, triumphant smirk twisting her perfectly painted lips as she tapped the microphone with a manicured fingernail, the sharp tap, tap, tap cutting through the suffocating silence, while her other hand gripped a flute of vintage champagne so tightly her knuckles were stark white, the icy condensation dripping onto the pristine white marble floor beneath her heels. Opposite her, trapped in the harsh glare of hundreds of judgmental, staring eyes, stood Marcus, an island of profound, uncomfortable poverty in a sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer dresses, his shoulders squared but his jaw tight, wearing a severely ill-fitting, faded navy, blue polyester suit that smelled faintly of mothballs, damp basement corners, and cheap industrial detergent, the fabric pulling awkwardly at his broad shoulders, the cuffs riding up too high on his wrists to expose a frayed, yellowing white cotton shirt collar. The crowd held its collective breath, a silent, predatory mass of silk and pearls, waiting for the slaughter. I mean, seriously. Chloe's voice boomed through the towering speakers, dripping with a venomous, syrupy condescension that made the hair on the back of Marcus's neck stand up, her eyes raking up and down his cheap attire with unvarnished disgust. Did you get lost on the way to a soup kitchen, or did you genuinely think that tragic little thrift store costume was appropriate for my wedding? Laughter, low and cruel, rippled through the room, a collective, sneering murmur of the elite closing ranks against the outsider, the sound hitting Marcus like physical blows to the chest. But he did not blink, did not flinch, did not look away from the venomous bride, his dark eyes burning with a quiet, terrifying intensity as the ice in Chloe's glass clinked softly in the tense, suffocating quiet. Man, I was standing right by the ice sculpture when she said that, and my stomach just dropped to the floor, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. You ever see a car crash happening in slow motion, and you can't look away? You can't do anything but watch the metal crumple and the glass shatter. That was this moment, right here. And what happened next? What happened when the doors at the back of that ballroom finally swung open? Stay with me, because you are not going to believe the absolute, earth-shattering karma that was about to rain down on this woman's perfect, arrogant parade. You see, to understand the sheer, catastrophic weight of the mistake Chloe was making in that glittering, suffocating room, you have to rewind the clock. You have to peel back the layers of the man standing in the cheap blue suit and understand the grinding, relentless, bone-deep struggle that forged him. The kind of struggle that leaves permanent calluses on your soul and dirt under your fingernails that no amount of scrubbing can ever truly wash away. Marcus wasn't just broke, he was invisible. The kind of invisible that happens when you exist exclusively to serve others. Waking up every single morning at 400 a.m., the harsh, digital blare of his cracked smartphone alarm dragging him out of a thin, lumpy mattress in a cramped, drafty, one-room apartment where the radiator clanked and hissed but never actually produced any heat, the frost building up on the inside of the single-pane window. He worked 3 grueling, back-breaking jobs just to keep the lights flickering and the eviction notices at bay, loading heavy, wooden pallets onto groaning freight trucks in the freezing pre-dawn dark, the coarse wood splintering against his thick-work gloves, scrubbing the sticky, soda-stained floors of a dilapidated diner during the chaotic lunch rush, the smell of stale grease and burnt coffee permanently woven into the fibers of his worn-out clothes, and stocking shelves in a fluorescent, lit grocery store until midnight, his back aching, his feet throbbing, his mind numb with exhaustion. He knew the agonizing math of poverty, the constant, low-level panic of calculating exactly how many boxes of generic pasta and cans of discount beans he could afford on a budget of $14 for the week, the sharp, hollow ache in his stomach, an old, familiar friend that he simply learned to ignore as he tightened his frayed leather belt another notch. He knew the bitter sting of walking miles in the pouring rain, because he was 25 cents short for the bus fare, his cheap canvas sneakers soaking through, the icy water freezing his toes, while expensive luxury sedans splashed muddy puddle water onto his jeans as they sped past him without a second thought. But Marcus never complained, never lashed out, never let the crushing weight of his circumstances extinguish the fierce, burning ember of his dignity. He moved through the world with a quiet, stoic grace, a steadfast belief that hard work, genuine kindness, and unyielding integrity were worth more than any bank account balance, a philosophy instilled in him by the harsh lessons of a life lived entirely on the absolute margins of society. He was an underdog in the truest, most visceral sense of the word, a man who had been knocked down, stepped on, and overlooked 1,000 times. Yet he always rose, his spirit bruised but never broken, his heart remarkably pure, a stark, glaring contrast to the hollow, materialistic vacuum of the world he was about to collide with. That world belonged entirely to Chloe, a woman whose entire existence was a meticulously curated, ruthlessly filtered monument to her own staggering vanity and bottomless sense of entitlement. A woman who had never known a single day of actual struggle, never felt the sharp, gnawing bite of hunger, never worn a piece of clothing that didn't have a designer label discreetly stitched into the collar. She was the wealthy, spoiled daughter of a real estate tycoon, a girl raised in cavernous, echoing mansions where the help was treated like invisible, easily replaceable furniture, taught from a young age that her net worth equated directly to her human worth, and that anyone who existed below her tax bracket was fundamentally inferior, lazy, and unworthy of basic human respect. Her $30,000 wedding was not a celebration of love, but a calculated, aggressive display of raw financial power, a theatrical production designed specifically to invoke crippling envy in her peers and cement her status at the absolute apex of her social circle. She had spent months terrorizing a small army of exhausted, terrified wedding planners, florists, and caterers, screaming until her throat was raw because the thousands of imported, incredibly rare white ghost orchids she demanded were a slightly different shade of ivory than she had envisioned, threatening to destroy businesses and ruin livelihoods with a single, vindictive Yelp review or a spiteful phone call to her father's aggressive legal team. She moved through life like a hurricane of expensive perfume and sharp edges, demanding absolute perfection and brutalizing anyone who fell short, her fiancé Lam trailing behind her like a beaten, compliant shadow, a weak-willed, passive man who had long ago surrendered his spine in exchange for a comfortable life funded by her family's massive fortune. The wedding venue itself was a staggering testament to excessive, unnecessary wealth, a historic, palatial estate overlooking a private, glittering lake, rented for an exorbitant, sickening sum, featuring towering ice sculptures of swans that wept freezing water onto silver platters, a 10-tier cake decorated with edible 24-carat gold leaf, and a staggering array of catering stations serving caviar truffles, and cuts of meat that cost more per ounce than Marcus earned in a grueling 12-hour shift. The sheer arrogance of the event was suffocating, a sterile, soulless bubble of privilege where every single detail, from the exact thread count of the pure linen napkins to the specific, harmonious pitch of the string quartet, was heavily scrutinized and flawlessly executed, leaving no room for error, no room for humanity, and certainly no room for someone like Marcus. How Marcus, a man who survived on instant noodles and tap water, ended up invited to this grotesque monument of excess was a cruel, twisted joke of fate, a hollow gesture born from an old, fractured childhood connection to Liam, the groom, a friendship forged in the dusty playgrounds of a public middle school long before Liam had sold his soul to Chloe's world. The invitation had arrived on Marcus's battered, rusted mailbox in a thick, heavy cream envelope, the golden calligraphy glistening mockingly under the flickering hallway light bulb of his apartment building, and holding it, feeling the expensive weight of the cardstock, Marcus had felt a deep, sickening pit open in his stomach, a profound, immediate dread. He knew he didn't belong, knew the lion's den he was walking into, but his unwavering loyalty, his deeply ingrained sense of honor, dictated that he show up, that he honor the ghost of the boy Liam used to be, regardless of the emotional cost to himself. But he had absolutely nothing to wear, his meager closet containing only grease-stained work uniforms, faded, heavily patched denim jeans, and a few plain, worn-out shirts that clung desperately to their remaining threads. So, he had taken his small, pathetic emergency fund, a crumpled wad of dollar bills and heavy handfuls of loose change kept in a cracked ceramic mug above his rusty sink, and walked 3 miles in the biting cold to a dimly lit, chaotic thrift store on the bad side of town, the bell above the door jingling weakly as he stepped into the musty, overcrowded aisles. The air inside smelled of dust, old books, and discarded lives, and he had spent hours sifting through racks of forgotten, moth-eaten garments until he found the navy, blue polyester suit, a relic from a bygone decade, the synthetic fabric stiff and unforgiving, the lapels slightly too wide, the seams strained and pulling. He bought it for $22, leaving him exactly enough change to buy a single cup of instant coffee on the way home, his pride fiercely intact despite the cheap, abrasive feel of the fabric against his skin, telling himself that a man's worth was measured by the respect he showed others, not the thread count of his trousers. On the morning of the wedding, the universe itself seemed determined to break his resolve, the sky a bruised, angry purple, unleashing a torrential, freezing downpour that turned the city streets into rushing, muddy rivers of gray sludge. Because he couldn't afford a taxi, let alone an Uber, Marcus took two separate, crowded public buses, standing for an hour and a half as wet, miserable passengers shoved past him, desperately trying to protect his cheap suit from the dripping umbrellas and splashing slush, holding a crumpled plastic grocery bag over his head as a makeshift shield against the relentless rain. When the bus finally dropped him off 2 miles from the private estate, he had to walk the remaining distance along a winding, muddy shoulder of the road, the cold rain seeping through the thin soles of his worn-out dress shoes, soaking his socks and chilling him to the absolute bone. He arrived at the towering, wrought iron gates of the venue looking like a drowned rat, shivering violently, his cheap suit clinging awkwardly to his wet frame, the valet drivers in their immaculate red coats pointing and snickering behind their gloved hands as he trudged past the endless line of gleaming Mercedes, Bentleys, and Rolls-Royces, his presence a glaring, offensive error in the perfect, wealthy matrix of the afternoon. Pushing open the heavy, intricately carved mahogany doors, the blast of warm, dry air hit him like a physical wall, heavily perfumed with the overpowering, sickeningly sweet scent of thousands of imported white orchids and roasting, expensive meats, immediately making him feel nauseous and deeply out of place. The grand foyer was blindingly bright, filled with people who moved with the effortless, liquid grace of those who have never had to rush or panic in their entire lives. The men in perfectly tailored, dark tuxedos, the women draped in shimmering silk and heavy, glittering diamonds that caught the light like tiny, sharp daggers. As Marcus stepped further inside, the water from his soaked clothes dripping softly onto the pristine white marble, creating a small, pathetic puddle. The ambient chatter of the room began to die down, a localized drop in temperature radiating outward as head after head turned to look at the intruder. Eyes, hard, cold, and assessing, swept over him, taking the frayed collar, the awkward, boxy fit of the polyester, the scuffed, muddy shoes, and the immediate, silent consensus was universally damning. The whispers began, a harsh, buzzing sound like a swarm of angry hornets, hands covering mouths, eyes rolling, lips curling in undisguised, profound contempt. He stood near the back, trying to blend into the shadows of a massive, sweeping staircase, his heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribs, his hands shoved deep into his pockets to hide their trembling, hoping against hope that he could just witness the ceremony, pay his respects to his old friend, and slip away into the rain unnoticed. But Chloe, with the predatory, unerring instincts of a shark smelling a drop of blood in a vast ocean, spotted him instantly across the crowded room, her eyes narrowing into sharp, malicious slits, the joyful, fox-sweet facade of the blushing bride melting away to reveal the cold, calculating cruelty underneath. She whispered something sharply into the ear of a passing bridesmaid, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at Marcus, and slowly, deliberately, the crowd began to part for her, a red sea of wealth dividing to let the predator approach her cornered, shivering prey. She glided across the floor, her massive gown whispering against the marble, a terrifying, beautiful monster closing the distance, the heavy scent of her expensive, musky perfume hitting Marcus long before she actually spoke, making his stomach clench in anticipation of the inevitable, brutal attack. The confrontation did not start with a shout, but with a low, hissing whisper, a weaponized volume designed to humiliate him quietly before the public execution, as she stopped 2 feet away, looking him up and down like he was a particularly disgusting piece of trash she had just found stuck to the bottom of her expensive designer shoe. "Who let you in?" she asked, her voice tight, cold, and dripping with venom, not waiting for an answer before continuing. "Look at you. You are dripping muddy water on my imported marble. You smell like a wet dog in a discount bin. Are you actually insane, or just so pathetically stupid you didn't realize this is a high-class event, not a soup kitchen line?" Marcus kept his chin level, his eyes locked onto hers, refusing to let the burning sting of tears form, his voice steady, deep, and remarkably calm despite the absolute hurricane of panic tearing through his chest. "I'm here for Liam," he said softly, the quiet dignity in his voice standing in stark, jarring contrast to her shrill, aggressive tone. "I'm his friend. I came to congratulate him." Chloe let out a sharp, ugly bark of laughter, loud enough to make the guests nearest them turn and stare, her eyes flashing with pure, unadulterated malice. "Friend," she scoffed loudly, the word tasting like poison in her mouth. "Liam doesn't have friends who buy their clothes out of garbage bags. You are an embarrassment, a filthy, disgusting eyesore ruining the aesthetic of my perfect day. And I want you out of here right this second before I have security literally drag you out by your cheap, frayed collar." The surrounding guests, smelling the blood in the water, began to edge closer, a ring of wealthy vultures gathering to watch the brutal entertainment, their faces twisting in sneering amusement, waiting for the poor boy to break, to cry, to beg, to finally realize his utterly worthless place in their grand, glittering hierarchy. It was then that Chloe, frustrated by Marcus's frustrating, unbreakable silence, his complete refusal to crumble under her assault, decided to escalate the situation from a private dressing down to a spectacular, public execution, turning sharply on her heel and marching directly toward the raised dais where the band had been playing. She snatched the microphone from the startled lead singer, the harsh squeal of feedback tearing through the room, bringing the entire wedding to a complete, breathless, terrifying halt, the silence heavy and expectant as she turned the full force of her wrath upon the man in the cheap polyester suit. She humiliated him systematically, methodically, tearing apart every visible aspect of his poverty, mocking his shoes, his suit, his hair, his very right to breathe the same conditioned, floral air as the rest of the glittering elite, her voice echoing off the gold ceilings, a relentless, merciless barrage of sheer, unadulterated cruelty. "We have an uninvited roach in the room, ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice booming. A pathetic, little charity case who thought he could crawl out of whatever sewer he lives in and rub shoulders with people who actually matter. "Security! Get this piece of absolute trash out of my sight before I vomit!" The crowd roared with laughter, a sickening, unified wave of mockery that crashed over Marcus, threatening to drown him, the heat rushing to his cheeks, his fists clenching so hard his short fingernails dug bloody crescents into his palms, the utter injustice of it all burning in his chest like a swallowed coal. He looked desperately at Liam, standing near the altar, but the groom simply looked down at his expensive, polished shoes, shifting uncomfortably, a coward refusing to meet the eyes of the boy who had once protected him from bullies, sealing Marcus's absolute, utter isolation in the hostile room. 3 massive, heavily muscled security guards in dark suits began pushing their way through the laughing crowd, their faces grim, reaching toward their belts for their radios, preparing to violently eject the underdog from the premises, the ticking clock of his humiliation nearing its explosive end. But Marcus did not run, did not cower, did not drop his head in shame. He stood absolutely still, his spine a steel rod, his eyes burning with a righteous, furious fire, absorbing every insult, every laugh, every mocking glance, storing the pain deep in his bones, waiting for the storm to pass. He knew something they didn't, a secret so immense, so heavily guarded, that he had lived his entire adult life in grueling poverty, just to prove a point to himself. To prove that he could survive without the crutch of his true legacy, a legacy that was currently marching up the front steps of the palatial estate. Because just as the largest security guard reached out a massive, meaty hand to grab Marcus by his frayed, cheap collar, the massive, 20-foot, tall, solid oak double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom did not just open. They were violently thrown wide with a deafening, thunderous crash that shook the walls and instantly killed the laughter in the room. The heavy brass handles slammed against the marble walls, and the sudden, shocking silence that fell over the 300 guests was absolute, a profound, terrifying vacuum of sound, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic, authoritative click-clack of heavy, bespoke Italian leather shoes striding purposefully across the marble floor. The man who entered did not walk. He commanded the space, his presence so utterly overwhelming, so radiating with raw, terrifying, unapproachable power that the air in the room seemed to physically thin out, making it hard for the wealthy guests to breathe. He was an older man, tall and broad-shouldered, with thick silver hair swept back from a face carved from granite, wearing a charcoal, gray, custom, tailored suit that cost more than the entire wedding reception, his eyes cold, sharp, and terrifyingly intelligent, scanning the room with the casual, predatory grace of a lion entering a cage full of frightened mice. It was Arthur Vance, the reclusive, legendary billionaire, a titan of global industry, a man whose name was whispered with absolute reverence in boardrooms around the world, a man who could buy and sell Chloe's real estate tycoon father a dozen times over before breakfast, without even looking at his bank balance. The crowd collectively gasped, a sibilant hiss of shock and sudden, desperate sycophancy. The wealthy guests instantly attempting to straighten their postures, to look important, to catch the eye of the god who had just descended into their midst. The security guards freezing in their tracks, completely forgetting about the man in the cheap polyester suit. Chloe's jaw practically unhinged, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock, awe, and immediate, calculated greed, her mind racing to figure out how to leverage this incredible, impossible stroke of luck. Assuming the billionaire was an unannounced, immensely important guest of her father's, preparing to deploy her most charming, sickeningly sweet smile. She dropped the microphone, the loud thud ignored by everyone, and began to aggressively push her way through the frozen crowd, shoving aside her own family members, desperate to be the first to greet the Titan, to welcome him to her perfect, expensive day, her arrogance completely blinding her to the terrifying reality of the situation. But Arthur Vance did not look at Chloe, did not acknowledge the desperate, fawning crowd, did not even glance at the staggering, multi-tiered gold leaf cake, his cold, piercing eyes locked instantly onto the solitary figure standing near the back, the man shivering in the dripping, cheap navy, blue polyester suit. Arthur's terrifying, stoic face suddenly softened, a profound, heavy emotion cracking the granite exterior, the coldness vanishing from his eyes as he walked directly past the desperately waving bride, leaving her standing there with her hand outstretched, completely ignored, a sudden, horrifying cold dread beginning to pool in her stomach. He walked straight to Marcus, the crowd parting for him not out of mockery, but out of absolute, terrified respect, the silence so deep you could hear the soft, ragged breathing of the young man in the wet suit, until the billionaire stopped right in front of him. Arthur raised a large, steady hand and gently, almost reverently, brushed a stray piece of wet lint off the shoulder of Marcus's ruined, cheap jacket, the gesture so intimate, so loaded with profound, undeniable history, that the entire room felt a sudden, seismic shift in the fabric of reality. "You look terrible, son," Arthur said, his deep, resonant voice carrying clearly through the massive, silent ballroom, the word son dropping like a literal atomic bomb into the center of the crowd, the shockwave physically rippling through the bodies of the 300 guests, shattering their arrogant reality into a million unrecoverable pieces. "I know, Dad," Marcus replied softly, a small, tired, but incredibly genuine smile finally breaking through his stoic mask, the immense, crushing weight of the last 3 years of grueling, self-imposed poverty and struggle finally lifting from his shoulders. It was a rough commute. The collective gasp from the crowd was loud enough to suck the oxygen from the room. Glasses slipped from numb fingers and shattered on the marble floor, completely ignored, as the terrifying, absolute truth finally dawned on them. The filthy, humiliated underdog they had just spent 10 minutes laughing at was the sole heir to the largest fortune in the hemisphere. The camera pans, if you will, to Chloe, her face draining of all color, turning a sickly, translucent white, her eyes wide with unadulterated, soul-crushing terror, her knees literally buckling beneath her as she realized she had just publicly, aggressively, and mercilessly humiliated the only son of a man who could destroy her entire family with a single, casual phone call. Her father, the arrogant real estate tycoon, was suddenly hyperventilating in the corner, clutching his chest, his face purple with panic, desperately trying to calculate how fast his empire was going to burn to the absolute ground. The power dynamic in the room flipping so violently, so completely, that the sheer force of it was dizzying. Arthur slowly turned around, placing a heavy, protective arm around Marcus's damp shoulders, and faced the terrified crowd, his eyes finding Chloe, his gaze no longer soft, but instantly returning to the cold, absolute, terrifying killer instinct that had built his empire. "This," Arthur began, his voice dangerously low, perfectly controlled, yet vibrating with a barely suppressed, righteous fury that made the nearest guests physically take a step back in fear. "It's my son, Marcus Vance. He chose to live without my money for 3 years to understand the value of hard work, a concept completely alien to everyone in this pathetic, gaudy room." He paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out, letting the sheer terror marinate in the hearts of the people who had laughed, his eyes locking onto Chloe, who was now trembling uncontrollably, tears of pure panic ruining her expensive, flawless makeup, her entire world crumbling around her. "I heard what you said, little girl," Arthur stated softly, the condescension in his voice infinitely heavier, infinitely more destructive than anything she had thrown at Marcus. "I heard you call my son trash. I heard you mock his clothes. I heard you tell security to throw him out. Well, let me save them the trouble." Arthur pulled a sleek, black smartphone from his pocket, his eyes never leaving Chloe's terrified face, the silence in the room absolute, unbroken, a heavy executioner's block waiting for the axe to fall. "I just bought this entire estate 10 minutes ago," Arthur stated coldly, pocketing the phone, "and I don't want you or your pathetic, sycophantic guests on my property for another second. The wedding is over. Get out of my house." Chaos, absolute and immediate, erupted. The band scrambled to pack their instruments. Guests pushed each other out of the way to reach the coat check. The desperate, frantic exodus of the elite fleeing from the absolute, crushing wrath of true power, their designer dresses snagging, their dignity completely destroyed, running out into the freezing, relentless rain. Chloe collapsed onto the floor, her $30,000 dress soaking up the spilled champagne and puddled water, sobbing hysterically, utterly broken, completely ruined, staring at the empty space where her perfect, arrogant life used to be, the consequences of her cruelty an undeniable, inescapable reality. Marcus didn't look back at her, didn't offer a word of gloating or revenge. His victory silent, absolute, and profoundly clean, he simply walked out the grand double doors beside his father, his head held high, the cheap, damp polyester suit looking suddenly like the most majestic armor ever forged, leaving the ruins of the arrogant antagonist entirely in his wake. Man, I am telling you, you could feel the justice radiating off the walls of that place long after they left, the absolute, undeniable proof that how you treat people when you think they have nothing is exactly what dictates what you deserve when you find out they have everything. Don't you ever judge a book by its cover. Don't you ever look down on the struggle, because you never, ever know who is watching, who is listening, and who is about to walk through those doors and flip your entire world upside down. Hit that share button if you believe karma never misses a single, well-deserved target, and remember to always stay humble, or the universe will absolutely do it for you.